Look, even if you watch a lot of police thrillers, it's likely you haven't quite seen one like Rebel Ridge. This is a new Netflix movie that is getting a lot of praise for the way that it handles the relationship between police and black people. Today on the show, what Rebel Ridge gets right. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Listen, Rebel Ridge is a new movie that just came out on Netflix. It is a police thriller. Let me just tell you about what it's about quickly. It centers on Terry. He's a black man forcibly detained by two white small-town cops while riding his bike, and the officers confiscate a large amount of cash that they find on Terry, even though the cash is legit. But the problem is that Terry needs that cash to bail his cousin out of jail. The twist here is that Terry is an ex-Marine, and he's not too happy with the way that he's being treated. Listen to the trailer.
I need to report a crime.
I didn't get his badge number, but his last name's Marston.
You're going to need to leave.
You can fight for the money, but that'll take you most of a year and cost you twice what you're owed.
You do not stand in my station in front of my officers and set terms. You need to be very, very careful.
Let's not do that.
A bit of the trailer for Rebel Ridge. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why we're talking about this movie. This movie is getting mostly positive reviews for something that is very specific and very hard to pull off, which is the way that it handles all the historic tensions between law enforcement and black communities. Sarah-Tai Black and David Dennis Jr. have a lot to say about this. They're both here. Sarah-Tai, David, welcome to the show, friends.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey.
I'm delighted that you're here. David, I'm going to start with you. Look, movies that mine the everyday injustices that black people face, like, those are not new to us. We have a lot of those. We have experienced a lot of those. That said, this movie is getting attention for its very particular approach to this topic. What do you think Rebel Ridge is doing right that makes it kind of feel different than other movies that try to do this?
So one thing that it's doing that is interesting, it is painting like the crookedness of the police as like something that all police sort of do, right? Like generally when we have these, especially an action movie where you have these crooked cops, it's like there's just something wrong with this particular station, right? There's something wrong with these cops. They're crooked. They bury evidence. They're part of the cartel, or they do something that is like sort of extravagantly evil, right? But the evil of this police force is that they do procedural things that a lot of police forces do. They steal money without any means to, and they redistribute it and do all this stuff, which happens all across the country, all across the world. And so they're painting that as the particular evil thing that the police are doing without having this sort of plot twist that the police chief is actually like running the mob or something like that. Like it is like really entrenched in this like real life corruption that does not feel as corrupt as you usually see in the action movies, in the fact that it's not just like so histrionic in the bad stuff they do.
Yeah, I think like watching the first maybe 30 minutes of this movie, you get the sense that it is rooted in a lot of legal information and like legal framework. And it's not at all trying to hide that. It's trying to say, like, here's somebody who knows their rights. And even still, these are the ways that police might be able to abuse those rights. But then also, Sarah-Tai, like, there's something interesting to be said about the fact that there's this transition in the movie where subtly it begins to earn the comparison to Rambo movies. What do you make of the comparison between Rebel Ridge and Rambo as a parallel?
I mean, I will say, as a huge fan of First Blood Part 2 specifically, I don't think Rebel Ridge reaches the heights of delirium that it does, but I definitely see why the comparisons are being made. Yeah. There's a lot of similarities with First Blood, the first of the Rambo franchise movies. You can also see like kernels of Clint Eastwood's archetypal screen characters here as well. And I think what Rebel Ridge is doing with those kind of longstanding tropes of, one moral man versus an immoral majority, or, kind of like Dennis was referring to, if it's not corruption, it's just bureaucracy in the way of like the people's justice, so to speak. But here we're getting it with a very specifically like sociopolitical bent, which is very much rooted in its main character's blackness and how that blackness changes how he's going to navigate law enforcement, how he's going to navigate judicial systems, how he's going to be surveilled in certain spaces and things like that. And kind of within that as well, like, speaking of the delirium of Rambo First Blood Part 2, no one can see, but I just opened my eye like, hey, he did in the movie. With our if you know, you know. But with Rebel Ridge, because of those, you know, very much real life urgent realities, you see him coming from this position of discipline, of a very restrained nonviolence up until a point. He's avoiding all confrontation because, you know, that is deadly for Black folks, never mind non-confrontation.
I can't lie to you. That's the part that makes this thing work, is that, like, it's the resisting of the confrontation, resisting and resisting. And the movie, to me, like, what it does best is building that tension. David, I got to ask you, how do you feel about this movie as an action movie? The way it sort of measures up to, like, the best of action movies. Where do you fall on this?
So as an action movie, I wanted a little bit more action. I know, like, they tried to have this thing where he was being nonviolent, all that stuff. The movie, to me, as like, if I'm going to go pure film critic, right?
Yeah.
It's like maybe 30 minutes too long, maybe one too few, like, action set piece, right? But I will say that Aaron Pierce is, like, that dude is he nails it. Like, this guy is an action star. Yeah. It's almost like he was, like, too good of an actor for an action movie. Like, a little bit at some points, it was like you are, like, really putting it in here. And I think that this is, like, one of those movies that's a launching pad.
Yeah.
For him to do other things. Like, I could totally see him. I know there was, like, speculation on Twitter about Bond movies and all that stuff, but I could see him doing a lot more action stuff. And this is, like, the movie that showed that he has those kind of chops.
There's this thing that you both have alluded to earlier, right? The idea of, like, balancing being an action movie with sort of being this deep and philosophical and legal exploration of being, like, an anti-Black police violence and corruption, all these themes, and then also introducing the idea of, like, justice and vengeance into all of this. David, how do you feel about the way that this movie juggles all those?
I think it tries. I feel like, you know, in terms of, like, getting into the muck of all that stuff, like, at some point, when there's a scene where the main character, he's riding his bike and he's going next to the guys on the bus, and there's, like, this sort of triumphant thing, and I paused the movie and I was like, let me look up the IMDb. A white guy wrote this and a white guy directed this, and that was, like, that became very clear throughout of it. Like, it felt like a guy who, you know, listened to a, like, criminal justice podcast and wanted to make a movie that made himself feel better, and did not really. The end kind of made me feel like he did something that said, I did it great. I would have voted for Obama a third time. But, like, what we have here is a situation where the cavalry that comes in is state police. Like, state police is what's going to save the day. And we have a thing where we have good apples are in here, and, like, it's not all cops. We have people, you know, like, it's still is propaganda. Like, we have to get to the point, like, this is still a piece of propaganda, and the understanding that we have good police and we have a larger infrastructure that justice here will save the day. That rings really, really hollow for me. And to the end of it, I kind of felt like, did this even need to be a Black guy in this movie? Like, this, like, are we even doing enough in talking about criminal justice and race to have it necessitate the Black guy being here? Because it feels like you could have had whatever the current stand-in for Bruce Willis is do this and be like, he's fighting a bunch of corrupt cops, and left, like, Black folks out, like, left me out of the narrative, because I was waiting for this moment to feel affirmed as a Black person in this, and I really just kind of felt like there were characters against, like, these corrupt police, and more good police come and make it better.
Okay, I really want to get to, I wish we had more time to get more into Rebel Ridge, but we don't, because I want to talk about something else, which is, I want to take a moment to celebrate the late, great James Earl Jones. This is an actor that we have had for a long time. We've been very fortunate to have James Earl Jones for a career that has spanned 60 years across stage and film. He's an EGOT. There's not that many people who have achieved the achievement of Emmy and Grammy and Oscar and Tony over their lifetime. Of course, you might remember him from movies like Coming to America or Field of Dreams or The Hunt for Red October. But I imagine most people will remember James Earl Jones as the voice of these characters.
If you only knew the power of the dark side, Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father.
He told me you killed him.
No, I am your father.
Look, Simba, a king's time as ruler rises and falls like the sun. One day, Simba, the sun will set on my time here and will rise with you as the new king.
I think when I hear that Mufasa speech, I'm like, is that my father, James Earl Jones?
Like, why am I about to cry, guys?
I know. There's nothing like James Earl Jones's voice. I mean, like those are the moments that we know him for. Maybe Sarah-Tai, you want to kick us off and just talk real quick about James Earl Jones's legacy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, considering my age, he was one of the first Black elders I ever saw on screen in such a commanding and frequent way and powerful. And, you know, he was very much giving one of the first Black actors of the stage, you know, an actor's actor. I think of like watching like Inside the Actor's Studio. Like he was really my introduction to the craft of acting, specifically as it is created and experienced and shaped by Black actors, and especially one who had committed his life to this craft over so many wildly different generations. You know, he really was the blueprint for that kind of Black artistry. And, you know, the way he combined so much of his like critically acclaimed work with like smaller character parts, you know, like Conan the Barbarian and things like that, it made he was really someone that you always get excited to see on screen. You're just always just like, oh, yes, things just got better. James Earl Jones is here. You know, he was a huge just win for Black artistry, and especially a Black artistry of the times that he lived through previous.
David, I want to maybe meditate for a moment on that concept that Sarah-Tai just introduced, because that's a significant one. I want to thank you for that, Sarah-Tai. The idea that James Earl Jones was, for a generation of people, one of the few Black elders that we get to see sort of carry on your career with significant dignity and then get to the place where you have earned every right to do whatever you wanted on screen. When you think about James Earl Jones, what does his legacy mean to you, David?
So I think of James Earl Jones as a Mississippian, as somebody who I was raised in Mississippi, and James Earl Jones, a Mississippian. As an aside, James Earl Jones, Morgan Freeman, both Mississippians. There's something about iconic voices that comes out of that state. Skip me, I don't have an iconic voice, but those two are like the two that you have. But like James Earl Jones, you think about, you know, especially from back then, especially how we think of how Mississippians are and the way the stereotypes of Black Mississippians, things like that, to come up and have this sort of like iconic voice, archetypal voice, especially in spaces where you don't necessarily think that voice, like a Black Mississippi man, should be a part of. Like, it is 2024 and people are arguing about Black folks in Star Wars, right? And he was the voice of the definitive Star Wars character, right? Yeah. You talk about other movies, family movies, with DEI hires and wokeness and all that stuff, this backlash, and he was the voice of Mufasa, right? Like, he played the voice of Mark Hamill's dad and Jonathan Taylor Thomas's dad. Like, these are the things that you have to command a certain respect to walk into these certain places and do that. And then, especially in the 70s and early, you know, like, these are things that happened at that time. And he had a voice and a career that commanded that respect, that people say, yeah, sure, of course, James Earl Jones should do it because that's who he is. That is the iconography of his voice. And that is from a young, you know, at the time, a guy who came up from as nobody, as an actor in Mississippi and made his way in Hollywood.
I think that is a perfect place to leave it. I'm going to go after this conversation and find a YouTube compilation of all the greatest James Earl Jones, just voice moments, but also just on-screen moments. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. Sarah-Tai Black, David Dennis Jr., you guys are the best. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Talk to you soon. Thank you, guys. Sarah-Tai Black is a film and culture critic based in Toronto. David Dennis Jr. is a veteran music journalist and culture critic based in Atlanta, Georgia. James Earl Jones died yesterday. He was 93 years old. You can read more about his life at CBC News. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. All right, listen. So all this week we've been talking a lot about TIFF because the Toronto International Film Festival is happening right now. And let me just tell you this. Here's a general rule. When you're trying to get people to see your movie and you don't have a huge marketing budget behind you, there is no better way to build buzz than having a film that some people want to shut down, especially when those people are Donald Trump and his lawyers.
Yes, hello, Judy. This is Donald Trump. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Be excited. Donald, now that the lawsuit is behind you, what do you want to do next?
Well, I intend to acquire the Commodore, and I'm planning on making it the best and the finest building in the city, maybe the country, in the world. Judy, in the world, it's going to be the finest building in the world. It's going to be a spectacular hotel, absolutely spectacular.
That is a scene from a new film. It is called The Apprentice. It stars Sebastian Stan as a young Donald Trump trying to build his brand back in the 1970s. And in the background of that clip, you might have heard the voice of Jeremy Strong, who plays Roy Cohn, who's a lawyer, of course, who helped kind of build Trump into this polarizing figure that he is today. This movie, The Apprentice, premiered last spring at Cannes to rave reviews, but then it became the target of a bunch of legal threats that have held up its release in North America. There's a Kickstarter now involved trying to raise money to get this film into theaters. The film's Canadian co-producer, Daniel Bekerman, is here. Daniel, welcome to the show, friend.
Hello, nice to see you.
I'm glad that you're here to talk about the long and bumpy journey of that this movie's taking to get to North American screens. Before we get into all the controversies around this movie, I'd like to maybe hear about the vision for the film, because it's been called a Donald Trump biopic, but I hear that is not your preferred way of describing this movie.
Yeah, I tend to not like biopics myself. Often it becomes like an exercise in box ticking. You just sort of say the highlights of the events of a person's life, and it ends up feeling kind of reductive. I always find it more interesting to try to go deeply into a more narrow part of a person's life and try to find something that is hopefully universal.
I assume going into this movie that you kind of had an inkling, had a rough idea that it would end up becoming a lightning rod for some controversies. What challenges did that present for you as you guys were trying to get this movie made and then get this movie off the ground?
Yeah, every movie is incredibly difficult to get made, truthfully. I've been making movies out of Canada for maybe 15 years or so now, and every single one has its own unique challenges. What you've got to do is you've got to identify what you think is actually worthwhile about each project and hold on to that for dear life. Yeah. And we definitely had that on this movie. To me, that thing that made it all worthwhile is I think this movie has something to say, and it's not just a political statement. A lot of people are assuming that it's one way or another politically. Truthfully, I think the exciting thing about this movie is that it's got something to say on a deeper level.
There's a disconnect, right, between like these two ideas. The idea that like, okay, on the one hand, you had this hard time making this movie. And on the other, you hear Donald Trump and his supporters say, oh, this movie only really exists because of the Hollywood liberal elites, who would like to create sort of liberal propaganda. Talk to me about how that depiction squares with your reality of just trying to get this movie made in this environment.
I would say that circle does not square. Okay. I was tickled pink to be called Hollywood elite. I very much a Canadian making movies in Canada, and put this movie together as a co-production between Canada and Ireland and Denmark, and have excellent partners in all those places. Ali, the director, is from Denmark, and I had been a huge fan of his movies. And if I hadn't been, I probably wouldn't have made the movie, because I don't want to make a movie just to sort of be sensational or anything like that. It's, like I said, I want to have something to say. I want to make sure the movie has its own voice, and it's a worthwhile voice, and it's not just replicating what everyone else is saying.
Okay, on top of calling you names, which, like, listen, the list of people that Donald Trump has called names is not that long. So, congratulations, I guess. Trump and his legal team have threatened to block the movie's release after it premiered at Cannes. What were their objections? What are they objecting to when they say this movie should not get out?
Well, I think that's maybe there's a kernel there that we can extrapolate a lot of other problems from, which is that they had not seen the movie at that point, right? So they made a lot of assumptions.
Sure.
And I think that's something a lot of people do a lot of the time these days. You know, do you hear one little piece of information and you assume a lot of other things? You know, Ali, our director, has repeatedly invited Donald to bring whichever family members and whoever else he wants to bring and sit down and enjoy the movie. We'd be happy to screen it for him. It's those assumptions that were made. It was literally an hour after our premiere in Cannes. I'm not inside his head. I think we're exploring something in this movie that might give insights, but I still can't imagine what he's thinking. But clearly there were assumptions made. But I think this movie will surprise a lot of people, maybe even him, when they actually see it.
Listen, the fact that you're saying, hey, Donald, come watch this movie, even though it's about you, remarkable to me. But also, I don't think we're going to get there. This does not seem to be the impression that we're getting. And the only reason I'm saying this is because, like, in addition to the legal heat from Trump's team, you've received this pushback from one of your investors, right? So, like, a new film company called Kinematics, it's owned by Dan Snyder, who's a close friend, a close personal friend of Donald Trump. He was one of the investors in this movie. And then you end up getting pushback from that investor. How do you navigate the fact that, that's how this movie got made? And then at the end of the day, because you don't see this kind of story very often. So do you want to talk about that?
Kinematics was our biggest and investor in the film, and like I mentioned before, getting any film made is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
So I'll always be grateful to them for getting this movie made. And now we're in a position where we're going to bring the movie to audiences. We need help. We need the help of the audiences to make sure this movie gets seen widely and is available for lots of people. And so that's why we've started this Kickstarter campaign. It's already doing quite well, but we want to make sure this movie gets seen, because honestly, I think it is worthwhile. I think it's something that does have something new to say. And I'm just deeply excited to see all of the spectrum of reactions that are inevitably going to come.
Daniel, I hear you denying that you are part of the Hollywood elite, and I believe you. But also, this movie is coming out, you're trying to put this movie out just a few weeks before the presidential election. The presidential election is in November. Your current release date is sometime in October. I think you said October 11th. Are you trying to sway public opinion? Is that a part of the aim here, to sort of be in conversation with the election with a direct aim of saying, here's something that should inform how you should vote?
I'm not so naive to think that's even possible, to be honest with you. I think people will make up their own minds. If this movie provides insights that, that allows people's thinking to evolve on anything, that's, wonderful, but I have absolutely no ability to control that, nor would I really try. I don't think that's the goal of the film. I think if a film is made for that purpose, it becomes political propaganda, and that's not what this movie is. To me, it's pretty hard to make a good movie that is also political propaganda, because when you're making political propaganda, you tend to be reductive and you tend to caricaturize your characters. And if you want to make a good movie, you've got to find depth, you've got to find nuance, you've got to hopefully have some kind of ability to empathize with your characters. And that is antithetical to propaganda. And I don't see this movie as propaganda at all. I see it as a great movie.
I think that is a good place to leave it. Daniel, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
Cheers. Very nice to meet you.
You bet. Likewise. Daniel Bekerman is a Canadian film producer and the founder of the production company Sci-Fi Films. Its latest release, The Apprentice, could hit theaters in October. That is it for the podcast today. But listen, before we go, I just want to tell you that this week, while TIFF is happening, we are doing a daily podcast that is catching up on everything that is happening at the festival, all in about 12 minutes or so, which is why we're calling it TIFF in 12. You can stream it right now. It's on our podcast feed. Our regulars, Rad Simon Pillay and Terry Hart, are all over the festival. So if you just check the Commotion podcast feed, you'll find a new episode of TIFF in 12 every single day that is running this week from Monday to Friday. That is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll see you tomorrow.